Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly mundane and often overlooked world of the American bison. Those massive, shaggy giants who roam the plains in what might be the most repetitive daily routine in the animal kingdom. While documentaries make them seem majestic and wild, the truth is being a bison is pretty boring. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are now 3 weeks old, which in bison terms makes you approximately as coordinated as a shopping cart with one broken wheel. Your legs have finally figured out they're supposed to work together, but they haven't quite gotten the memo about grace or efficiency. You move through the world like someone trying to operate 4 pool noodles while wearing oven mitts. The herd has decided it's time to move again. Not because of any particular emergency, mind you, that's just Tuesday in bison society. Someone, somewhere, has determined that the grass 30 miles south is marginally greener than the grass here. And when you're a creature whose entire existence revolves around optimizing your fiber intake, marginally matters. You watch the adults prepare for migration with the same casual efficiency your mother uses for literally everything else. There's no committee meeting, no group discussion about optimal routes or weather conditions. The lead cow simply starts walking, and 2,000 other bison think, well, I guess we're doing this now. It's democracy in its purest form, mob rule, but with more chewing. Your first attempt at keeping up reveals several uncomfortable truths about your place in the natural order. First, you discover that keeping up is a relative term when applied to a herd that moves like a furry avalanche. The adults flow around obstacles with fluid precision, while you approach each minor incline like it's personally challenging you to single combat. A small creek appears ahead, barely 2 feet wide and shallow enough that the adults step over it without breaking stride. You approach this aquatic challenge with the confidence of someone who has never encountered moving water before. Which, to be fair, you haven't. Your first step lands in the creek, with a splash that announces your incompetence to every predator within a 5-mile radius. Your second step somehow finds the one smooth rock in the entire stream bed. You execute what could generously be called a controlled fall, but which looks more like someone dropped a furry ottoman from a moderate height. The herd doesn't wait. Why would it? You're one calf among dozens, and natural selection has a schedule to keep. Your mother glances back with the expression of someone whose teenager just asked if they could drive the car to Mexico. Mild concern mixed with the weary acceptance that disaster is probably inevitable. You scramble out of the creek, water dripping from your chin in a way that suggests dignity was never really an option. The herd has moved perhaps 50 yards ahead, close enough that you're not abandoned, far enough that you'll need to hustle. And hustling, you're learning, is not your strong suit. Following the herd turns out to be more complex than simply walking behind everyone else. There's an art to it, a subtle choreography that the adults perform without conscious thought. They flow around rocks, gullies, and patches of poor grass like water finding its way downhill. You, meanwhile, walk directly into every obstacle with the determination of someone who believes walls are just suggestions. The social dynamics become apparent as you struggle to find your place in the moving mass. There's an invisible hierarchy that determines who walks where, and apparently, being small and unsteady puts you somewhere between tolerated and actively avoided. Older calves shoulder past you with casual indifference. Adults step around you like you're a puddle they'd rather not deal with. You try walking near your mother, but she's busy with the serious business of adult bison life, which mostly involves looking stoic while chewing. You try following another calf, but they seem to know secrets about navigation that no one bothered to teach you. Eventually, you settle into a position that could best be described as somewhere in the middle of organized chaos, trusting that as long as you can see brown fur in every direction, you're probably going the right way. The learning curve is steep and occasionally painful. You step in holes that the adult bison somehow know to avoid. You walk into bushes that everyone else navigates around with mystical precision. You develop a healthy fear of prairie dog burrows after your 4th near faceplant of the morning. But gradually, incrementally, things start to click. You begin to notice the subtle shifts in the herd's movement that signal obstacles ahead. You learn to read the ground the way adults do, seeing the slight depression that indicates a hidden gully, recognizing the type of grass that grows in soggy areas best avoided by creatures who prefer their hooves dry. The other calves start to seem less mysterious and more like fellow students in the same remedial course on how to be a bison without embarrassing yourself. You form loose alliances based on shared incompetence. There's comfort in knowing you're not the only one who occasionally walks into things that aren't moving. By the end of your first real migration day, you've covered maybe 8 miles. The adults could have done twice that distance, but they've accommodated the pace of their offspring with the patience of tour guides leading a group of enthusiastic but directionally challenged tourists. You collapse into sleep that night with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully avoided being eaten, abandoned, or significantly injured. Tomorrow, you'll do it all again. And the day after that. This, you're beginning to understand, is what following the herd actually means. Not blind conformity, but the learned skill of moving through the world as part of something larger than yourself, even when that larger thing occasionally steps on your feet. Your education in staying alive begins with a lesson that every nature documentary gets wrong. Predators don't announce themselves with dramatic music and slow-motion sequences. They appear as distant shapes that could be rocks, shadows that might be bushes, or sounds that probably aren't anything important, but make every adult in a half-mile radius suddenly develop perfect posture. Your first wolf sighting happens on a Tuesday morning while you're focused on the crucial business of figuring out which end of a grass blade tastes best. One moment, you're conducting serious research into fiber optimization, and the next moment, every adult around you has transformed from relaxed grazer to hypervigilant security system. The wolves are maybe 300 yards away, 5 grey shapes moving with the kind of purpose that suggests they're not out for a casual nature walk. From this distance, they look disappointingly small. Movies have led you to expect creatures the size of small horses, all gleaming teeth and dramatic backlight. These look more like medium-sized dogs who've been hitting the gym regularly but aren't quite ready to audition for a horror film. This size assessment, you quickly learn, is not reassuring. If anything, it's worse. Large, obvious predators you can see coming. Medium-sized predators with actual hunting skills are the ones that require constant vigilance. The adult's response is a masterclass in controlled paranoia. There's no panic, no dramatic gesturing or loud warnings. Instead, the entire herd performs a choreographed dance of casual repositioning. Mothers move closer to their calves without appearing to move at all. Bulls shift positions to create better sight lines and defensive angles. Everyone continues grazing, but now their heads lift every few seconds to scan the horizon with the methodical efficiency of radar dishes. You try to mirror this behavior, but your version of subtle vigilance looks more like someone who just remembered they left the oven on. Your head movements are too frequent, too obvious. When you try to graze while staying alert, you end up staring intensely at individual grass blades, like they might contain hidden messages about predator locations. Your mother notices your amateur hour performance and positions herself between you and the general direction of the wolves. It's a simple gesture that communicates volumes. I've got this covered, but you should probably start paying attention to how this works. The wolves maintain their distance, following the herd like interested observers at a parade they're not sure they want to join. They're looking for opportunities. The sick, the injured, the young and stupid. You qualify for at least one of those categories, possibly 2 depending on how you handle yourself. Over the following hours, you begin to understand the adult's constant low-level paranoia. Every shadow could hide a predator. Every sound might be a signal of danger. Every moment of inattention could be the moment something with teeth decides you look like lunch. It's exhausting, this perpetual alertness, but it's also oddly comforting. When everyone around you is watching for danger, the responsibility doesn't fall entirely on your still developing survival instincts. You learn the art of strategic positioning within the herd. The center is safest, surrounded by relatives who serve as early warning systems and, if necessary, slower-moving alternatives for predators with commitment issues. The edges are for adults who can handle themselves in a crisis. The very back of the herd is for bison who've made peace with their mortality, or who have confidence in their ability to outrun whatever's chasing them. Your preferred position becomes what you privately think of as aggressively average, close enough to the center to benefit from group protection, but not so obviously cowardly that other calves start questioning your commitment to bison values. It's a delicate balance between survival and social standing, which pretty much sums up the entire adolescent experience across species. The concept of being surrounded by relatives who are slightly slower than you becomes your primary survival strategy. It's not that you want anything bad to happen to your cousins. You're just realistic about the mathematics of predation. When something with teeth starts chasing the herd, it's going to catch somebody. Basic probability suggests it should be someone else. This leads to a subtle but ongoing assessment of your herd mate's relative fitness levels. That cousin who always seems slightly winded? Potential decoy? The calf who stumbles frequently? Backup plan. Your own mother, who moves with the fluid efficiency of someone who's been avoiding predators since before you existed. Definitely someone to stay near. You never downwind. You learn after one embarrassing incident where your scent apparently announced your presence to everything in a quarter-mile radius. Wind direction becomes as important as grass quality in determining where you position yourself. There's no point in being strategically placed within the herd if you're broadcasting your location like a furry radio tower. The adults teach you to read danger in the behavior of other animals. When the prairie dogs disappear, something's wrong. When birds change their flight patterns, pay attention. When your own herd mates start moving differently, not dramatically, just with slightly more purpose than usual, it's time to be somewhere else. Most importantly, you learn that survival is a team sport. Individual heroics are for movies and idiots. The bison who lives longest is the one who pays attention to group wisdom, who trusts the collective paranoia of 2,000 other creatures who've been playing this survival game longer than you have. The wolves eventually lose interest and drift away, probably deciding that a herd this alert and well-organized represents more work than they're willing to invest on a Tuesday. You never see them actually leave. They're just there one moment and gone the next, like shadows dissolving at sunrise. But the lesson stays with you. The world is full of things that would like to eat you. And your best defense isn't speed or strength or cunning. It's being part of something larger than yourself. Something with more eyes, more experience, and more commitment to collective survival than any individual predator can match. That evening, as you settle down to sleep surrounded by the warm bulk of your relatives, you understand something fundamental about bison life. It's not particularly exciting, but it's very, very good at keeping you alive. Calf politics, you discover, operates on principles that would make a medieval court seem straightforward by comparison. At least humans have the courtesy to be obvious about their power struggles. Bison society conducts its dominance negotiations through a complex system of nudges, stares, and strategic grass stealing that requires a degree in social anthropology to fully appreciate. Your first real lesson in bison diplomacy comes when you approach what appears to be an uncontested patch of particularly good grass. It's slightly greener than the surrounding forage, with that tender look that suggests optimal digestibility. In human terms, it's basically the equivalent of finding an unguarded pizza slice at a party. You approach with the confidence of someone who believes in first-come, first-served principles. This, you learn, is where your understanding of bison society reveals its fundamental gaps. A cousin, one of those calves who hit their growth spurt early and now carries himself like he's already applying for adult membership, appears beside the grass patch. He doesn't say anything, because bison don't really do verbal communication beyond the occasional snort. Instead, he employs a technique that you'll later recognize as aggressive proximity. He doesn't push you away from the grass. He doesn't make threatening gestures or obvious displays of dominance. He simply positions himself in a way that makes it clear that continuing to graze in this location would require you to graze uncomfortably close to someone who's bigger than you and mildly irritated about your presence. You have several options. You could stand your ground and turn this into an actual confrontation. You could attempt to share the grass patch in some kind of civilized compromise. Or you could read the social cues, acknowledge that discretion is the better part of valor, and find a different patch of grass that doesn't come with territorial complications. Being 3 weeks old and still figuring out how your own legs work, you choose option 3. You move to a nearby patch of slightly less optimal grass and pretend this was your plan all along. Your cousin settles into the premium grazing spot with the satisfaction of someone who's just successfully negotiated a minor but important territorial dispute. This interaction teaches you several crucial things about bison social dynamics. First, size matters, but it's not the only thing that matters. Your cousin's advantage wasn't just his physical bulk, it was his willingness to commit to the confrontation. Second, most disputes can be resolved through careful positioning and subtle intimidation rather than actual violence. And third, there's no shame in tactical retreats when the stakes are low and the alternatives are plentiful. You begin to pay more attention to the subtle hierarchies within your age group. Some calves carry themselves with natural confidence, approaching each interaction like they expect to get their way. Others, like yourself, adopt a more cautious approach, testing boundaries carefully and backing down when the cost-benefit analysis doesn't look favorable. There's an art to this social navigation that the adults make look effortless. They seem to know instinctively who they can push around and who requires more diplomatic approaches. Dominance isn't just about physical strength. It's about reading situations accurately and knowing when to assert yourself and when to yield. Bison society, you realize, runs on a simple but flexible principle. Bigger wins, except when older wins, except when hungrier wins, except when more motivated wins, except when having a bad day wins. The key is learning to assess these variables quickly and accurately in each situation. Your own position in this hierarchy starts to crystallize through a series of minor encounters. You're not the smallest calf in your age group, but you're not the largest either. You're not the most aggressive, but you're not completely passive. You settle into a comfortable middle position, respected enough that smaller calves don't push you around, but not confident enough to challenge the obvious dominance. This middle ground strategy serves you well. You avoid most serious confrontations while still maintaining access to decent grazing spots and comfortable sleeping positions. It's not the most exciting social role, but it's remarkably low stress and allows you to focus on the important business of growing larger and more competent. You also learn that alliances matter. Other calves in similar positions become natural allies, not through any formal agreement, but through a shared understanding of how to navigate the social landscape without unnecessary drama. You graze near each other, sleep in similar areas, and occasionally support each other in minor disputes through strategic positioning and moral support. By the end of your first month, you've developed a working understanding of calf politics that will serve you well as you grow larger and the stakes get higher. You know who to avoid, who you can probably handle in a confrontation, and who makes for reliable allies. Most importantly, you've learned that Bison society, for all its apparent simplicity, operates on layers of subtle complexity that require constant attention and careful navigation. It's exhausting, this social awareness, but it's also oddly satisfying. You're not just growing physically, you're developing the skills you'll need to function as a member of Bison society. And society, you're beginning to understand, is what keeps everyone alive. As summer begins its slow retreat toward autumn, you notice changes that go beyond the obvious shift in temperature. The grass tastes different, not dramatically, but with subtle variations that somehow register in ways your brain can't quite articulate. It's like when humans claim they can taste the difference between types of bottled water, except in your case, the distinction actually matters for survival. The adults have been increasingly restless, lifting their heads more frequently from grazing to scan the horizon with the expression of people who've forgotten something important but can't remember what. There's a sense of anticipation in the herd, a collective awareness that change is coming whether anyone's ready for it or not. Your first real migration begins not with dramatic fanfare, but with your mother simply starting to walk in a direction that seems arbitrary, until you realize that several hundred other bison are walking in the same direction. This, you're learning, is how most major life decisions get made in Bison society, through a kind of collective unconscious consensus that bypasses the need for committee meetings or strategic planning sessions. The initial excitement of going somewhere new fades quickly into the realization that migration is basically just walking, but with more purpose and significantly less flexibility about rest breaks. Your legs, which have finally gotten comfortable with the basic mechanics of forward motion, are now being asked to maintain that motion for distances that seem to stretch beyond the edge of the world. But there's something oddly meditative about the rhythm once you settle into it. Step after step after step, with the warm bulk of your relatives surrounding you like a moving security blanket. The landscape scrolls past with hypnotic regularity. Grass, rocks, more grass, occasional shrubs that break up the monotony without fundamentally changing the basic aesthetic of brown and green things extending to the horizon. You begin to understand that life, at its core, is exactly this, walking from one patch of grass to another patch of grass, occasionally interrupted by weather. There's a simplicity to this existence that's either profoundly peaceful or mind-numbingly boring, depending on your philosophical perspective and your comfort level with routine. The weather, when it interrupts, does so with enthusiasm. Your first real thunderstorm as part of a migrating herd teaches you that nature doesn't particularly care about your travel schedule. The rain arrives like someone dumping buckets from a considerable height, and lightning turns the prairie into a temporary disco with significantly higher stakes. The herd handles the storm with typical bison pragmatism. They keep walking, but slower, and with the resigned attitude of commuters who've accepted that their day is going to be longer and wetter than planned. You learn to walk with your head down, letting the rain run off your increasingly shaggy coat, while trying not to step in the growing puddles that turn solid ground into a slip-hazard obstacle course. By the time autumn settles in properly, with its shorter days and grass that crunches underfoot with the first touches of frost, you've completed your transformation from confused newborn to marginally competent juvenile bison. You're still not particularly graceful, and you still occasionally walk into things that aren't moving, but you can now keep up with the herd without causing delays or requiring dramatic rescue operations. The seasonal cycle is becoming clear to you, not just the obvious changes in weather and landscape, but the deeper rhythm that governs bison life. Spring for calving, summer for growing, autumn for moving, winter for surviving. Repeat until further notice. It's a pattern as old as the grass itself, and you're now part of it in a way that feels both humbling and oddly empowering. You're no longer the newest member of the community. Another season will bring new calves, and you'll get to watch them stumble through the same learning process you've just completed. The thought of being the experienced one, the calf who knows things, fills you with premature confidence that will undoubtedly lead to its own educational opportunities. But for now, as the herd settles into its winter routine, and you find your place among the warm bodies that will keep you alive through the cold months ahead, you're content to be exactly what you are, a young bison who successfully navigated his first season of being alive, with reasonable prospects of surviving several more. Early autumn arrives like a polite but insistent dinner guest. You can ignore it for a while, but eventually it's going to make its presence known. The grass has started its annual transition from green and optimistic to brown and philosophical, and the air carries that crisp edge that suggests winter is somewhere in the distance, checking its watch and making travel arrangements. The great movement begins without fanfare, because bison society doesn't believe in dramatic announcements. One morning, the lead cow simply starts walking south with the determination of someone who's remembered an important appointment. Within minutes, 2,000 other bison fall into line behind her, like the world's most massive and least choreographed conga line. You've participated in migrations before, but those were training wheels versions, short hops from one grazing area to another, more like changing seats in the same restaurant than actually going somewhere new. This is different. This has the weight of serious intention behind it, the kind of purposeful movement that suggests you won't be seeing this particular stretch of prairie again until spring decides to make another appearance. The rhythm of the herd in full migration is hypnotic in the way that only truly repetitive things can be. Thousands of hooves striking the earth in an uneven but constant percussion, creating what could generously be described as the world's most boring drum circle. There's no melody, no variation, no dramatic crescendos, just the steady, eternal sound of large mammals putting one foot in front of the other, with the mechanical persistence of a very slow, very furry metronome. At first, the novelty keeps you alert. New landscapes scroll past like a nature documentary with particularly good production values. Rolling hills give way to different rolling hills. Grass yields to slightly different grass. Rocks are replaced by other rocks that look suspiciously similar to the previous rocks, but are presumably more southern in their geological orientation. But as the hours stretch into days, and the days begin to blend into each other like watercolors in the rain, you discover one of the most valuable skills in the bison repertoire: learning to sleep while walking. It starts as brief micro-sleeps, moments where your consciousness takes a quick coffee break, while your legs continue their steady march on autopilot. Your brain learns to partition itself, keeping the essential navigation and balance systems running while allowing the higher functions to take short vacations. This skill, you realize, would serve you well in countless meetings later in life. If bison had meetings, which they don't, because bison have more sense than to sit around in circles discussing action items when they could be walking or eating or doing literally anything more productive than talking about doing things. The technique requires a delicate balance. Too little sleep, and you start stumbling over your own feet with increasing frequency. Too much sleep, and you wake up to discover you've been following the wrong group of brown furry shapes for the past hour. The optimal approach involves a kind of meditative half-consciousness, where you're aware enough to maintain your position in the herd, but relaxed enough that your mind can process the day's experiences and file them away in whatever passes for bison long-term memory. Your first river crossing teaches you that water, unlike grass, has opinions about your survival that it's not shy about expressing. The river appears ahead like a geographical plot twist, a strip of fast-moving silver cutting across the landscape, with the casual arrogance of something that was here first and isn't particularly interested in accommodating your travel plans. The adults approach the water with the resigned efficiency of people who've dealt with this particular inconvenience before. They know the crossing points, the depths, the current patterns. They wade in with steady confidence while you stand on the bank, calculating the odds that this is the moment your luck finally runs out. The water, when you finally commit to entering it, is cold in a way that makes your breath catch and your muscles clench involuntarily. It's also faster than it looks from the shore, with an urgent energy that seems designed to remind you that you're a land animal attempting to navigate an environment where you have no particular expertise or evolutionary advantage. Halfway across, with the current pushing against your legs and the far shore still looking optimistically distant, you understand something fundamental about rivers. They are completely indifferent to your survival. The water doesn't care if you make it across safely. It doesn't care if you slip on the smooth rocks or get swept downstream, or simply decide that this whole migration thing was a terrible idea and you'd rather be back on dry land, eating grass, and avoiding complex hydrological challenges. This indifference is somehow more unsettling than active hostility would be. A predator at least acknowledges your existence, even if it wants to eat you. Water just flows around you like you're a temporary obstacle in its path to somewhere more important. But you make it across, emerging on the far shore with water streaming from your coat and a new appreciation for the solid, predictable nature of dry ground. The herd continues without pause, because rivers are just another part of the landscape to be navigated, like hills or valleys or patches of particularly stubborn vegetation. The migration continues, day after day, until the rhythm becomes so ingrained that you can't imagine any other way of existing. Walking becomes as natural as breathing. The landscape changes so gradually that you don't notice the transitions. One day you realize you're in a completely different ecosystem than where you started, but you can't pinpoint exactly when the change occurred. Your legs grow stronger without you noticing, the same way your confidence grows without conscious effort. The daily challenges that seemed overwhelming during your first week of migration become routine problems with routine solutions. You learn to read the herd's movement patterns, anticipating changes in direction or pace before they become obvious. You develop an intuitive sense of timing, knowing when to rest and when to push harder. Most importantly, you begin to understand migration not as a journey with a specific destination, but as a way of being in the world. The movement itself becomes the point, not the arriving. You're not traveling to somewhere specific. You're participating in an ancient pattern that's larger than any individual bison's understanding or intention. The landscape around you shifts from familiar to foreign to familiar again, as your definition of home expands to include everywhere the herd goes. Territory becomes less about specific locations and more about the space immediately around your relatives, a mobile sense of belonging that travels with you wherever the season's demands might lead. By the time you reach what the adults seem to consider your winter destination, a sheltered valley with adequate grass and protection from the worst weather, you've completed your transformation from passenger to participant in the great seasonal rhythm that governs bison existence. You're no longer being carried along by the herd's momentum. You're contributing to it, adding your own steady hoofbeats to the eternal percussion section that marks time across the endless grasslands. Somewhere between your 4th and 5th month of existence, your body finally gets the memo that it's supposed to be keeping pace with your appetite. This is fortunate, because your appetite has been operating under the assumption that you're built like a small mountain and need to consume proportional amounts of vegetation to maintain optimal function. You wake up one morning to discover that your legs have grown during the night, adding what feels like several inches of additional leverage between you and the ground. It's a subtle change, but one that affects every aspect of movement in ways you hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, obstacles that required careful negotiation can be stepped over with casual ease. Streams that once demanded strategic planning become minor inconveniences that barely interrupt your stride. Your shoulders broaden with the steady inevitability of continental drift, adding bulk that changes how other animals perceive you. What was once obviously a juvenile bison, harmless, slightly ridiculous, deserving of protective patience from adults, is gradually becoming something more ambiguous. You're not quite adult-sized, but you're no longer obviously child-sized either. You've entered that awkward transitional phase, where people aren't sure if they should treat you as a large child or a small adult, and opt for a cautious middle ground that involves more respect than you're used to receiving. This newfound physical presence leads to your first successful intimidation of a prairie dog, an achievement that does more for your confidence than it probably should. Prairie dogs, in fairness, are not particularly challenging opponents. They're essentially small, nervous rodents whose primary survival strategy involves screaming at any threat larger than a butterfly and then disappearing underground with the speed of furry lightning. But when a prairie dog pops up from its burrow, takes one look at your approaching bulk, and immediately dives back underground with what sounds distinctly like panic, you experience a rush of empowerment that feels completely disproportionate to the actual accomplishment. You've successfully intimidated something that looked at you and decided that discretion was the better part of valor. You are, clearly, becoming a force to be reckoned with. This confidence boost leads to a period of what could charitably be called testing your limits, or more accurately described as finding creative ways to embarrass yourself. You approach larger animals with newfound boldness, only to discover that a young elk is significantly less impressed by your bulk than a prairie dog was. You attempt to assert dominance over other young bison who are experiencing similar growth spurts and similar delusions of grandeur, leading to awkward confrontations that neither party knows how to properly escalate or gracefully exit. These experiences teach you the crucial distinction between size and timing. Being larger than your opponent is certainly an advantage, but knowing when and how to use that advantage is what separates successful intimidation from embarrassing overreach. There's an art to reading situations accurately, to understanding not just your own capabilities but your opponent's motivation level, their confidence, and their willingness to commit to a confrontation. You learn this lesson after attempting to claim a prime grazing spot that's already occupied by another young bull, who's roughly your size but significantly more experienced in the politics of resource competition. The confrontation escalates through the standard stages of bison diplomacy: aggressive proximity, meaningful stares, subtle positioning for advantage, until you both realize that neither of you is entirely sure what the next step should be. The stalemate stretches awkwardly until the other bull employs a technique you hadn't considered. He simply ignores you and continues grazing with the focused intensity of someone who's decided this isn't worth his time. It's a masterclass in confident dismissal that leaves you standing there feeling like someone who's prepared an elaborate argument for a debate that the other person has chosen not to participate in. But the experience teaches you something valuable about timing and commitment. The other bull won his victory not through superior size or aggression, but through superior understanding of the situation's actual stakes. He correctly assessed that the cost of escalation outweighed the benefits of the disputed territory, and he communicated this assessment in a way that allowed both parties to maintain dignity while resolving the conflict. Your growing strength manifests in subtler ways as well. Your endurance improves steadily, allowing you to maintain the herd's pace during long migration days without the constant low-level exhaustion that characterized your earlier months. Your balance becomes more reliable, reducing the frequency of embarrassing stumbles and ungainly recoveries that marked your earlier attempts at adult-level coordination. Most importantly, you begin to move through the world with a different kind of presence. Where once you navigated carefully around obstacles, testing each step and planning contingencies, you now approach challenges with the assumption that your strength and size are sufficient to handle whatever problems might arise. It's not quite confidence, that will come later, but it's a kind of practical optimism based on accumulated evidence that your body is becoming capable of handling the demands of bison life. The gradual realization that you're becoming genuinely dangerous sneaks up on you like a sunset, so incremental that you don't notice the change until you look back and realize how different things have become. Dangerous not in the dramatic sense of a movie villain, but in the thoroughly mundane way of a large animal with the potential to cause serious harm through simple carelessness or momentary inattention. Your hooves, which once seemed like oversized accessories that you hadn't quite grown into, now strike the ground with solid authority. Your head, when lowered in the classic bison threat posture, presents a formidable combination of bone and muscle that could easily cause significant damage to anything unfortunate enough to be on the receiving end. Your bulk, when set in motion, carries enough momentum to knock over smaller animals without conscious intention on your part. This dawning awareness of your own capacity for harm brings with it a new kind of responsibility. You begin to move more carefully around smaller animals, not out of fear, but out of courtesy. You learn to moderate your enthusiasm during play with other young bison, understanding that what feels like gentle roughhousing to you might feel quite different to the recipient. The transformation from harmless juvenile to potentially dangerous adolescent happens gradually enough that you don't feel fundamentally different, but the world's reaction to you changes in ways that can't be ignored. Other animals give you more space. Adult bison treat your approaches with more consideration. Even your own mother begins to relate to you less as a dependent, and more as a fellow adult in training who deserves consultation rather than just protection. By the end of this growth phase, you've developed the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own capabilities without needing to constantly test or display them. You're still learning, still making mistakes, still occasionally overestimating your abilities or underestimating challenges. But you're no longer the wobbling, uncertain juvenile who needed constant guidance and protection. You're becoming something more solid, more reliable, more genuinely dangerous in the most boring and practical way possible. Weather, you discover, is less like a random force of nature and more like a constantly updating newsletter that you never subscribed to, but somehow became essential reading for your survival. The trick is learning to read the subtle editorial content hidden in what seems like environmental background noise. Grass, it turns out, is an excellent meteorologist. Long before you notice changes in wind patterns or cloud formations, the vegetation around you begins its own preparations for incoming weather systems. Grass leans away from approaching storms like a nervous introvert trying to avoid an overly enthusiastic conversation partner. The angle and intensity of this lean provides surprisingly accurate information about both the timing and severity of whatever atmospheric drama is heading your way. You begin to notice these patterns during your daily grazing routines. A subtle shift in how the grass moves, a change in the way it reflects light, a difference in the sound it makes when the wind passes through it. These variations mean nothing to creatures who don't spend the majority of their time with their faces inches from the ground. But for a bison, they constitute an early warning system more reliable than any weather app. The different types of grass communicate different types of information. The tall prairie grasses respond to barometric pressure changes hours before storms arrive, bending and swaying with increasing agitation as atmospheric conditions destabilize. Shorter grasses provide more subtle cues about humidity and temperature shifts. Even the weeds, those opportunistic plants that grow in the margins between proper grass territories, contribute their own specialized forecasting services, particularly regarding wind direction changes and precipitation timing. Your palate develops the kind of sophisticated discrimination that would make a wine sommelier envious. Except instead of detecting hints of oak and berry, you're identifying the subtle differences between good grass, okay grass, and grass that tastes like disappointment. This isn't mere preference, it's practical survival information about nutrition content, digestibility, and seasonal viability. Good grass has a sweetness that indicates optimal growing conditions and high nutritional value. It crunches with a satisfying resistance between your teeth and leaves a pleasant aftertaste that encourages continued consumption. This is the grass you seek out during times of plenty, the premium dining experience of the bovine world. Okay, grass fulfills the basic requirements of being edible and providing necessary nutrients, but without the enthusiasm-inspiring qualities that make eating a pleasure rather than a chore. It's the reliable, unremarkable foundation of your diet, not exciting but consistently available and adequately nourishing. This is the grass that sustains you during migration and carries you through seasons when premium options are scarce. Grass that tastes like disappointment is technically edible, but provides the kind of dining experience that makes you question your life choices. It's bitter where it should be sweet, tough where it should be tender, and somehow manages to be both filling and unsatisfying at the same time. This grass teaches you important lessons about desperation and standards, how far you're willing to compromise your preferences when alternatives are limited, and how to distinguish between genuine scarcity and simply being picky about your options. The art of finding shelter in terrain that's basically one giant, flat room requires creativity and a willingness to think three-dimensionally about two-dimensional landscapes. The Great Plains appear, at first glance, to offer about as much shelter as a parking lot, but experienced observation reveals subtle variations in topography that can provide meaningful protection from wind, rain, and temperature extremes. Creek beds, even dry ones, create natural windbreaks and offer slightly warmer microclimates during cold weather. The lee side of even modest hills provides shelter from prevailing winds. Clusters of rocks or vegetation create pockets of calmer air that can make the difference between manageable discomfort and genuine hardship during severe weather. You learn to read the landscape like a blueprint, identifying these shelter opportunities long before you need them. During pleasant weather, you catalogue potential refuge sites along migration routes, noting their capacity, accessibility, and protection characteristics. This advanced planning proves invaluable when storms arrive with the sudden intensity that characterizes prairie weather systems. The relationship between wind direction and terrain features becomes crucial knowledge. A hill that provides excellent shelter from northerly winds might offer no protection from storms approaching from the west. A creek bed that's perfect refuge during dry weather becomes a dangerous flood risk during heavy rain. Learning to assess these variables quickly and accurately becomes second nature, the kind of spatial reasoning that operates below conscious thought until circumstances require rapid decision-making. Your understanding of seasonal patterns deepens beyond simple recognition of temperature and precipitation changes. You begin to anticipate the timing of grass growth cycles, predicting when different areas will offer optimal grazing based on elevation, soil composition, and historical weather patterns. This knowledge allows you to arrive at prime feeding locations just as they reach peak nutritional value, maximizing the efficiency of your foraging efforts. The subtle interplay between different environmental factors becomes increasingly apparent as your observation skills sharpen. You notice how wind patterns change throughout the day, how topography affects local weather conditions, how the behavior of other animals provides additional information about environmental conditions beyond what you can directly sense. Water sources reveal themselves through vegetation patterns, soil moisture, and the behavior of birds and insects long before they become visible. You learn to identify these indicators from considerable distances, allowing the herd to navigate efficiently toward hydration without wasting energy on unnecessary detours or extended searches. By the end of this learning phase, you've developed an intuitive understanding of your environment that operates like a sixth sense. You can predict weather changes hours in advance, locate shelter opportunities in apparently featureless terrain, and assess grass quality with a glance. Most importantly, you've learned to integrate all these environmental inputs into coherent decision-making frameworks that guide your daily choices about where to graze, when to move, and how to position yourself for optimal comfort and safety. The prairie, which once seemed like an empty expanse of grass and sky, now reveals itself as a complex, dynamic system full of information and opportunities for those with the patience and skill to read its subtle communications. Your place in the social hierarchy begins to crystallize like ice forming on a pond, gradually, inevitably, and with a clarity that becomes more obvious to everyone involved as the process completes itself. After months of tentative interactions and experimental dominance displays, you've settled into a position that could be diplomatically described as somewhere between not worth bothering and might be worth bothering. This ranking represents a comfortable middle ground in bison society's meritocracy of size and attitude. You're large enough that smaller bulls don't automatically assume they can push you around, but not quite imposing enough that larger bulls feel the need to establish dominance through dramatic confrontations. It's the social equivalent of being reliably average, a position that offers surprising advantages in terms of stress management and energy conservation. Your first real friendship develops with another young bull who occupies a similar position in the social stratosphere. Neither of you is the biggest, fastest, or most aggressive in your age cohort, but you both possess the wisdom to recognize that alliance building might be more valuable than individual posturing. You bond over mutual confusion about the finer points of adult bison behavior and shared bewilderment at the apparently arbitrary nature of some social conventions. This friendship operates less like human relationships and more like a practical partnership based on compatible confusion levels. You graze near each other, not out of emotional attachment, but because your combined vigilance provides better predator detection than individual alertness. You support each other in minor disputes, not from loyalty, but from the practical understanding that reciprocal assistance benefits both parties more than competitive isolation. The relationship teaches you that bison society, despite its reputation for stolid individualism, actually operates on subtle networks of mutual assistance and shared interest. Even creatures as famously independent as bison benefit from strategic alliances, though they'd never admit it in terms that dramatic. Late summer arrives with the kind of oppressive heat that makes you question every life choice that led to having a thick, dark coat in an environment where shade is more theoretical than practical. But this year, something else arrives with the heat. A new kind of restlessness that settles into your bones like an unwelcome house guest who's decided to redecorate your emotional furniture without asking permission. The hormones announce their presence with all the subtlety of a marching band rehearsing in your brain at 3 a.m. One day, you're a reasonable, level-headed young bull focused on the important business of optimal grass consumption and efficient nap scheduling. The next day, you're discovering that you have strong opinions about other males that you didn't previously know you possessed, and these opinions are apparently non-negotiable. It starts small. A young bull grazing perhaps 50 yards away catches your attention in a way that has nothing to do with his grass selection technique or his positioning relative to potential predators. There's something about his presence that strikes you as fundamentally objectionable. Maybe it's the casual way he's occupying space that you've suddenly decided should be yours. Maybe it's his general attitude, which seems insufficiently deferential considering that you exist and have opinions about things. Maybe it's just the fact that he's there, being male and roughly your age and apparently comfortable with circumstances that you've suddenly found deeply unsatisfactory. The rational part of your brain, the part that's been successfully managing your survival for the past year and a half, observes this development with the detached interest of a scientist studying an unexpected chemical reaction. This is new, it notes. This intensity of focus on social positioning rather than environmental threats or feeding opportunities represents a significant shift in priorities that probably deserves some analysis. But the rational part of your brain is rapidly being outvoted by other systems that have their own agenda and aren't particularly interested in scientific observation. These systems are broadcasting a simple, insistent message that bull over there is a problem that requires a solution, and the solution probably involves some kind of physical demonstration of your relative capabilities. You approach this first real dominance challenge with the enthusiasm of someone who's read about swimming but never actually been in water. The theoretical knowledge is there. You've observed adult bulls during rutting season, noted their posturing techniques and escalation patterns. You understand the basic principles: display size, project confidence, communicate willingness to escalate, hope the other party decides. Discretion is the better part of valor. The practice turns out to be significantly more complex than the theory suggested. Your opponent, and he's definitely become an opponent, though neither of you could articulate exactly what you're competing for, seems to be operating from the same instruction manual you are. He approaches with the careful aggression of someone who's pretty sure this is how these things work, but isn't entirely confident about the specifics. The initial phase involves a lot of meaningful staring and strategic positioning. You move closer to his general area while trying to look like the proximity is coincidental. He continues grazing while making it clear through posture and attention that he's aware of your approach and not particularly intimidated by it. You both engage in elaborate displays of casual confidence that fool absolutely no one, including yourselves. The escalation follows predictable patterns that feel both instinctive and completely artificial. Heads lower gradually, presenting those impressive skull structures that evolution designed specifically for these moments. Bodies turn to display maximum size and muscle definition. Snorting increases in frequency and volume, creating a soundtrack that's half threat display and half respiratory exercise. The awkward dance of dominance reaches its peak when you both realize that neither of you is entirely sure what the next step should be. The adult bulls you've observed make this look effortless. A few moments of posturing, a brief but decisive physical confrontation, a clear winner and loser. Everyone returns to their regularly scheduled programming. But adult bulls have the advantage of experience and genuine confidence in their own capabilities. You and your opponent are basically two teenagers who've challenged each other to a fight, but haven't quite figured out how fights are supposed to work. The posturing phase has gone on longer than either of you expected, and the energy required to maintain aggressive displays is becoming a significant drain on resources that could be better spent on actual survival activities. The stalemate stretches until your opponent employs a strategy that catches you completely off guard. He simply loses interest and walks away, not in defeat, not in obvious retreat, but with the casual dismissal of someone who's decided this entire interaction isn't worth the energy investment. It's a masterclass in conflict de-escalation that leaves you standing there in full threat display, looking like someone who's prepared an elaborate presentation for an audience that's already left the room. The experience teaches you several crucial lessons about the nature of dominance and intimidation. First, that intimidation is approximately 60% size, 30% attitude, and 10% hoping the other guy is having an off day, or simply isn't that interested in whatever you think you're competing for. Size matters, but commitment matters more, and genuine indifference can be more powerful than any amount of aggressive posturing. Second, you learn that the winner of a dominance contest isn't necessarily the one who's more aggressive or even larger, but the one who better understands the stakes and the cost-benefit analysis of escalation. Your opponent won that encounter not by defeating you, but by correctly assessing that victory wasn't worth the energy expenditure and potential injury risk. The hormonal intensity doesn't fade with this first encounter. If anything, it intensifies as the season progresses. You find yourself drawn into several more confrontations with other young bulls, each one teaching you something new about the complex social mathematics of dominance establishment. Some you win through superior size or determination. Some you lose to bulls who've had more practice or better instinctive understanding of the psychological components of intimidation. Most importantly, you begin to understand that rutting season isn't really about winning or losing individual confrontations. It's about establishing your position in a complex hierarchy that will determine your access to resources, territory, and eventually mating opportunities. Each interaction contributes data points to a collective assessment of your capabilities, temperament, and commitment level that every other bull in your age cohort is simultaneously conducting and being subjected to. The season progresses with a series of increasingly sophisticated dominance negotiations. You learn to read the subtle signals that indicate whether an opponent is genuinely committed to escalation or just going through the motions of territorial defense. You develop techniques for projecting confidence, even when you're not entirely sure you could back it up with performance. Most importantly, you begin to understand the difference between strategic aggression and pointless hostility. By the end of your first real rutting season, you've established yourself as a competent but not dominant presence among the young bulls in your area. You can hold your own in most confrontations, but you're not yet ready to challenge the established hierarchy of older, more experienced males. It's a position that offers reasonable access to resources without the constant stress of defending a high-status position you're not quite ready to maintain. The experience leaves you with a new understanding of your own capabilities and limitations. You're genuinely dangerous now, capable of causing serious harm in a confrontation, but you're also aware that being dangerous and being wise are two different things. The bulls who consistently win their encounters aren't necessarily the strongest or most aggressive. They're the ones who choose their battles carefully and understand that true dominance is about more than just physical capability. As the hormonal intensity of late summer begins to fade and your attention returns to the more prosaic concerns of grass quality and weather patterns, you carry with you a new kind of confidence. Not the artificial bravado of someone trying to convince others of their strength, but the quiet assurance of someone who's tested themselves against legitimate challenges and emerged with a realistic understanding of their place in the world. The establishment of your first semi-permanent routine happens gradually, like developing a taste for a particular type of coffee or finding the perfect walking route through your neighborhood. It's not a conscious decision, so much as the natural result of repeatedly making small choices that gradually coalesce into larger patterns of behavior that eventually feel inevitable. The hill you choose for morning grazing isn't the highest hill in the area, or the one with the best grass, or the most strategically defensible position. It's simply the hill that consistently provides what you need: decent forage, good sight lines for predator detection, and the right combination of sun exposure and wind protection to make early morning meals pleasant rather than merely functional. Over the course of several weeks, you find yourself returning to this same location with increasing regularity, until it stops being a hill where you sometimes graze and becomes your morning hill. The valley you select for afternoon naps follows similar logic. It's not the most sheltered valley or the one with the softest grass for sleeping, but it offers something more valuable: predictability. The temperature is consistent, the wind patterns are reliable, and the approach routes provide adequate warning time if anything threatening decides to investigate your rest area. Most importantly, it's positioned at the right distance from your morning grazing area, close enough that the walk doesn't consume excessive energy, far enough that the change of scenery provides psychological benefits that you can't articulate but definitely experience. This routine develops its own satisfying rhythm over the course of several months. Wake before dawn on your sleeping hill, walk to morning grazing hill, spend several hours optimizing nutritional intake, walk to afternoon nap valley, conduct essential midday sleeping, return to evening grazing areas that vary based on seasonal grass availability and weather conditions. It's a schedule that would make a productivity consultant weep with joy. Every activity serves a specific purpose. Every transition is optimized for efficiency. Every location is selected based on measurable benefits. The satisfying monotony of a life well organized around eating and napping reveals itself as one of adulthood's underappreciated pleasures. There's a deep contentment in knowing exactly where you'll be at any given time of day, in having routines so well established that they require minimal conscious decision-making. Your days become predictable in the best possible way, not boring, but reliably structured around activities that provide genuine satisfaction and measurable benefits to your survival and well-being. Other bison begin to notice your consistency, and you discover that they respect routine almost as much as they respect size. Reliability, it turns out, is a form of strength that doesn't require constant physical demonstration. Bulls, who establish consistent territorial patterns, are generally left alone by other bulls, who understand that challenging someone in their own well-established routine is more work than most disputes are worth. Your territorial claims aren't dramatic or extensively defended, but they're clear enough that other bison understand the boundaries and generally respect them. It's not that your morning hill becomes off-limits to other animals. Bison territorial behavior isn't that rigid or exclusionary. But your regular presence there establishes a kind of informal reservation system where other bulls understand that challenging your access would require legitimate justification rather than casual opportunism. The psychological benefits of this territorial establishment surprise you with their intensity. Having specific places that are reliably available for specific activities provides a sense of security that goes beyond simple resource access. It's the difference between being a nomad who must constantly evaluate and compete for every meal and rest opportunity, and being a landowner who can plan activities around reliable assets. Your first encounter with humans occurs during one of your routine afternoon naps, when the distant sound of mechanical noise gradually penetrates your consciousness like an alarm clock that someone forgot to turn off. You lift your head to discover a small group of bipedal creatures standing perhaps 100 yards away, pointing rectangular objects in your direction and making the kinds of excited vocalizations that suggest they've discovered something they consider noteworthy. Humans, you immediately notice, smell like soap and anxiety. The soap component is straightforward enough. They clearly engage in cleaning behaviors that involve artificial chemical substances rather than natural dust wallows or water submersion. The anxiety component is more subtle, but equally obvious to anyone with functional olfactory capabilities. They emanate nervous energy like a low-frequency broadcast, the scent of creatures who are simultaneously fascinated by and terrified of the natural world they're observing. Their behavior patterns are puzzling but not particularly threatening. They maintain respectful distance while engaging in what appears to be extensive documentation activities. They point their rectangular objects at you with the focused intensity of scientists collecting important data. Though what data they might be gathering from watching a bison take a nap is unclear, they communicate with each other in excited whispers that carry farther than they probably realize, discussing your activities with the kind of detailed analysis typically reserved for more dramatic behaviors than lying in grass and occasionally shifting position for optimal comfort. The encounter teaches you that humans, while strange and artificially scented, generally respect bison territorial boundaries and don't pose immediate threats to routine napping activities. They seem more interested in observation than interaction, which aligns well with your own preferences for uninterrupted rest periods. Their presence becomes a minor but manageable adjustment to your afternoon routine, something to monitor without necessarily being alarmed about. Over time, you begin to recognize regular human visitors who return to observe your routine with the dedication of commuters following a familiar schedule. Some arrive early in the morning to document your transition from sleeping to grazing activities. Others prefer late afternoon observations of your napping techniques. A few seem particularly interested in your territorial boundary maintenance behaviors, taking extensive notes whenever you engage in minor disputes with other bulls over grazing access. The realization that your daily routine has become sufficiently interesting to attract regular human documentation provides an unexpected source of validation. Apparently, the careful optimization of your eating and sleeping schedule represents something worthy of study and appreciation. Your territorial establishment and routine maintenance behaviors are significant enough to warrant repeated observation by creatures who presumably have other options for how to spend their time. This external validation reinforces your own satisfaction with the lifestyle choices you've made. The routine that provides you with optimal nutrition, adequate rest, and reliable territorial security is evidently also aesthetically pleasing and behaviorally interesting to outside observers. You've achieved that rare combination of personal satisfaction and external recognition that marks a truly successful approach to adult life management. As your first year of established territorial routine concludes, you've created a sustainable framework for adult bison existence that balances resource optimization with energy conservation, territorial security with social flexibility, and individual satisfaction with community integration. It's not the most exciting lifestyle by adventure standards, but it's remarkably effective at achieving the fundamental goals of survival, comfort, and gradual improvement in social status and physical capability. The routine becomes so ingrained that disruptions feel genuinely unsettling, like someone rearranging the furniture in your house while you're sleeping. When weather forces, temporary relocations, or social dynamics require territorial adjustments, you experience a mild but persistent sense of displacement until new patterns can be established. But this attachment to routine, rather than being a limitation, becomes one of your greatest strengths, the foundation that allows you to navigate more significant challenges with confidence and efficiency. Your first real blizzard, as an adult, arrives like a cosmic practical joke, as if the universe has decided to test whether you've been paying attention during all those theoretical discussions about winter survival techniques. One morning, you wake up to discover that someone has replaced the familiar brown and green landscape with a monochromatic nightmare that extends in every direction, like the world's least helpful abstract art installation. The snow isn't falling, it's attacking. Horizontal sheets of ice crystals driven by winds that seem personally offended by your existence. The temperature has dropped to levels that make you question fundamental assumptions about the relationship between atmosphere and livability. Most unsettling of all, the familiar landmarks that normally provide navigation assistance have been erased by uniform white coverage that makes every direction look exactly like every other direction. Winter, you realize, is nature's way of asking, "Are you sure you want to keep doing this?" It's not a polite inquiry about your commitment level. It's the kind of aggressive questioning that suggests the questioner already knows the answer and is just waiting for you to admit defeat. Every aspect of basic survival becomes exponentially more difficult when the environment actively opposes your continued existence rather than merely remaining indifferent to it. The wind is the worst part, not just because of the temperature reduction, but because of its relentless psychological pressure. It never stops, never varies in intensity, never provides brief respites that might allow you to adjust to the conditions gradually. It's like being interrogated by someone who never gets tired, never runs out of questions, and never accepts any answer as satisfactory. Finding shelter becomes an exercise in creative geometry, trying to position your bulk in relation to other large objects in ways that create pockets of slightly less hostile air. Every rock formation, every slight depression in the terrain, every cluster of vegetation becomes a potential windbreak worth investigating. The art lies in balancing the energy expenditure of reaching potential shelter against the energy conservation benefits of whatever protection it might provide. Group huddling presents its own complex social negotiations. Everyone understands the thermal efficiency benefits of collective body heat sharing, but nobody wants to admit they need help staying warm. The challenge is participating in survival-critical heat conservation while maintaining individual dignity and social standing within the hierarchy you've worked so hard to establish. The huddle forms gradually, organically, with each bison pretending their movement toward the group is motivated by something other than desperate need for warmth. You edge closer to other animals, while maintaining the fiction that you're simply conducting routine position adjustments for optimal wind protection. Others do the same, until eventually you're all pressed together in a formation that nobody officially organized but everyone tacitly agreed was necessary. The social dynamics within the huddle are fascinating and slightly uncomfortable. Normal territorial boundaries become meaningless when survival depends on physical proximity to animals you'd normally maintain respectful distances from. Dominance hierarchies remain in effect, but they're expressed through position within the huddle rather than through space control. The most dominant animals claim the center positions with maximum protection, while lower status individuals accept positions on the periphery, where they serve as windbreaks for the group while receiving minimal thermal benefits themselves. Your position within the huddle reflects your established social standing, not central enough for optimal warmth, but not peripheral enough to constitute a sacrifice for the greater good. It's a middle ground placement that provides adequate survival benefits while confirming your status as a solid, contributing member of the community without being particularly special or expendable. Finding grass under snow becomes a form of archaeology for the perpetually hungry, requiring skills that nobody teaches you but everyone expects you to develop through trial and error. The snow creates a uniform surface that conceals not just grass, but also rocks, holes, and other obstacles that could complicate excavation efforts. Every potential digging site becomes a gamble. Invest energy in snow removal without knowing whether edible vegetation lies beneath, or continue searching for more promising locations while hunger levels increase. You develop techniques for reading snow conditions that might indicate grass accessibility. Areas where the snow appears slightly different in texture or color might suggest vegetation underneath that's affecting the snow's settling patterns. Slight depressions might indicate grass areas that are more sheltered from wind and therefore more likely to have survived the initial frost. Even the behavior of other animals provides clues about where successful foraging might be possible. The digging itself requires careful energy management. Too aggressive, and you exhaust yourself before uncovering sufficient food to justify the caloric expenditure. too cautious, and you spend so much time and energy on excavation that you could have walked to a different location and found more easily accessible food sources. The optimal approach involves quick assessment of snow depth and density, followed by strategic digging that maximizes grass access while minimizing energy waste. Success in winter foraging depends largely on patience and systematic searching rather than random excavation. You learn to work methodically across potential grazing areas, testing multiple sites before committing to extensive digging at any particular location. This approach requires more time but provides better overall nutrition return on energy investment. The psychological challenges of winter survival prove as demanding as the physical ones. The constant pressure of survival requirements, combined with reduced food availability and increased energy demands, creates a mental state that oscillates between grim determination and existential questioning. The days are shorter, the nights are longer, and the activities that normally provide satisfaction, leisurely grazing, comfortable napping, social interaction, become survival-focused exercises in resource optimization. But there's also a peculiar satisfaction in winter survival that you don't experience during easier seasons. Every day you remain alive and functional represents a genuine achievement rather than simply the continuation of comfortable routine. Every successful foraging expedition, every night you maintain adequate body temperature, every morning you wake up with energy for another day of survival, challenges becomes a small victory worth acknowledging. Spring's return feels less like celebration and more like parole, the gradual relaxation of conditions that have been testing your commitment to continued existence for months. The first green shoots appearing through melting snow don't inspire joy so much as relief that the examination period is finally ending. The increasing daylight and warming temperatures signal not new beginnings, but the return to normal difficulty levels after an extended period of enhanced survival challenges. The transition from winter to spring happens gradually enough that you don't immediately recognize the improvement in conditions. One day you realize you're no longer calculating energy expenditure for every movement, no longer assessing every potential food source in terms of caloric return on investment, no longer positioning yourself primarily for thermal efficiency rather than personal preference. Winter survival leaves you with increased confidence in your own capabilities and a deeper appreciation for the seasonal cycles that govern bison existence. You've passed a fundamental test of adult competence, proving to yourself and your community that you can handle the worst conditions your environment regularly presents. This knowledge becomes part of your identity, informing your approach to future challenges with the quiet assurance of someone who's already survived genuinely difficult circumstances. At 5 years old, you have transformed into something that could be diplomatically described as a furry tank with attitude, or more accurately characterized as 2,000 pounds of muscle, bone, and carefully cultivated intimidation wrapped in a coat that makes you look deceptively cuddly from a distance. The awkward juvenile who once stumbled into creeks and got nudged away from premium grass has evolved into something that other large mammals cross the street to avoid. If large mammals had streets and understood traffic safety, your physical presence now commands attention in ways that your younger self could only dream about. When you move through the landscape, smaller animals take notice and make accommodation plans. Prairie dogs disappear into their burrows with the urgency of someone who's just remembered an important appointment underground. Even other predators reassess their afternoon hunting schedules when they notice your bulk moving across their territorial boundaries. The transformation isn't just physical. Though the physical changes are certainly impressive, your shoulders have broadened into something that could serve as a mobile siege engine. Your head has developed the kind of bone density that evolution clearly intended for settling disputes through cranial percussion. Your legs have become pillars of concentrated power that can propel your considerable mass across difficult terrain with surprising grace and alarming speed. But the real change is in the way you carry yourself. The subtle shift from someone who's still figuring things out to someone who's mastered the basic requirements of existence and is now operating from a position of confident competence. It's visible in your posture, audible in the way you breathe, tangible in the space that other animals automatically create around you without being asked. Claiming your first real territory during rutting season feels like finally being allowed to participate in conversations you've been overhearing for years. The prime grazing areas and water access points that were previously defended by older, more established bulls are suddenly within your reach, not because they've become undefended, but because you've become capable of meaningful defense. The process of territorial establishment involves a series of carefully calibrated confrontations with other bulls who've had similar ideas about upgrading their real estate portfolios. These encounters operate on entirely different principles than the experimental dominance displays of your younger years. There's less posturing and more genuine assessment of capabilities, less theatrical aggression, and more business-like evaluation of whether the other party is genuinely committed to escalation. Your first successful territorial claim comes after a brief but decisive confrontation with a bull who's been holding a prime riverside grazing area through reputation rather than recent demonstration of defensive capability. The interaction lasts perhaps 10 minutes from initial approach to final resolution, but those 10 minutes represent the culmination of years of physical development and social learning. The satisfaction of watching other males give you a wide berth provides the kind of validation that no amount of self-confidence can replicate. When bulls who previously treated you as a peer now approach your territory with the cautious respect reserved for genuinely dangerous animals, you understand that you've crossed some invisible threshold into the ranks of bison who matter in the larger social calculations of the herd. Mating season turns out to be brief, intense, and surprisingly administrative in its execution. The dramatic passion that movies suggest should accompany reproduction is replaced by something more like efficient resource allocation. Females assess your territorial holdings, your physical condition, and your demonstrated ability to defend both, then make practical decisions about genetic partnerships based on straightforward cost-benefit analysis. The actual mating process involves significantly less romance and significantly more logistics than you'd anticipated. There's timing to coordinate, competitors to discourage, and territorial boundaries to maintain while conducting reproduction activities that require temporary attention to matters other than perimeter security. It's multitasking at a level that would challenge a professional project manager, except with much higher stakes and no possibility of calling in sick when the pressure becomes overwhelming. The females, you discover, approach the entire process with the pragmatic efficiency of someone selecting contractors for home renovation projects. They evaluate your capabilities, inspect your territorial assets, and make informed decisions about whether your genetic contribution represents good value for their reproductive investment. There's nothing particularly flattering about being assessed like livestock, but there's also something reassuringly straightforward about interactions based on objective criteria rather than mysterious emotional variables. Your success during this first prime mating season isn't measured in dramatic conquests or romantic satisfaction, but in the practical metrics of territorial defense and genetic partnership agreements successfully negotiated. You maintain control of your claimed territory throughout the rutting period, successfully discourage challenges from competing bulls, and establish mating relationships with several females who apparently consider your combination of size, territorial assets, and defensive capability to represent acceptable genetic partnership opportunities. The realization that dominance is mostly about looking like you don't care, while caring intensely, becomes one of the defining insights of your adult social education. The bulls who maintain the highest social status aren't necessarily the most aggressive or the most obviously powerful, but the ones who project calm confidence in their own capabilities while remaining constantly alert to potential challenges. This requires a delicate balance between visible strength and apparent relaxation. You must be obviously capable of handling any reasonable challenge while simultaneously appearing so unconcerned about potential threats that challenging you seems pointless rather than promising. It's performance art of the highest order, requiring you to maintain constant vigilance while projecting casual indifference to the very threats you're monitoring most carefully. The psychological demands of this performance prove more exhausting than the physical requirements of territorial defense. Maintaining the appearance of effortless dominance while conducting continuous threat assessment creates a kind of mental split-screen operation, where part of your consciousness projects calm authority, while another part runs constant security analyses of every interaction and environmental change. But the benefits justify the effort. Bulls who master this balance of obvious capability and apparent unconcern find that most potential challenges resolve themselves without escalation. Younger bulls looking for opportunities to advance their status generally choose targets who appear more obviously concerned about their position, interpreting defensive anxiety as evidence of vulnerability that might be exploitable. Your territorial holdings stabilize around a collection of prime grazing areas and water access points that provide everything necessary for optimal nutrition and comfort. The boundaries aren't marked with physical barriers, but they're clearly understood by every bull in the area through a combination of scent marking, regular patrol patterns, and occasional demonstration of your willingness to defend these assets against encroachment. The maintenance of these territorial claims becomes a routine background process that operates below conscious thought most of the time. You automatically adjust your daily movements to include boundary patrols. You unconsciously position yourself for optimal defensive advantage during routine activities. You instinctively monitor the activities of other bulls who might be evaluating your territorial assets for potential acquisition opportunities. By the end of your first season as a truly dominant bull, you've established yourself as a major player in the local social hierarchy. Your territorial holdings are respected, your defensive capabilities are acknowledged, and your genetic partnership opportunities reflect your status as a premium reproductive option. Most importantly, you've developed the kind of confident authority that makes leadership feel natural rather than like an exhausting performance that might collapse at any moment. The transformation from competent young adult to dominant prime-age bull feels both gradual and sudden, like watching sunrise and realizing that daylight has arrived, without your noticing the exact moment when darkness became light. You're still fundamentally the same animal who once face-planted in prairie dog holes and got intimidated by cousins, but you're operating from a completely different position of strength and social authority. Leadership, you discover, is less about dramatic decision-making and more about being the one who happens to be paying attention when everyone else is focused on their own immediate concerns. It arrives not through appointment or dramatic revelation, but through the gradual accumulation of situations where your judgment proves more reliable than the available alternatives. Your first real leadership moment occurs during a routine migration when the herd approaches a river crossing that looks different from previous years. The water level is higher, the current faster, and the usual crossing point appears to have shifted due to seasonal flooding that's altered the riverbank configuration. The established trail leads to water that's moving with the kind of aggressive enthusiasm that suggests crossing might be more complicated than usual. The herd slows as it approaches the water, creating that particular kind of bovine traffic jam that occurs when large animals encounter unexpected obstacles. The lead cow, normally decisive about route selection, pauses at the water's edge with the expression of someone who's suddenly uncertain about previously reliable navigation information. Other adults cluster around the crossing point, conducting visual assessments and apparently reaching different conclusions about the viability of the traditional route. Into this moment of collective uncertainty, you find yourself stepping forward, not through conscious decision, but through the kind of instinctive response that emerges when someone needs to do something, and you happen to be the someone who's available and marginally qualified. Your experience with this particular river crossing, combined with your current physical capability and your recent success in other leadership situations, makes you the logical candidate to test alternative crossing options. You move upstream along the bank, looking for sections where the water might be shallower or the current less aggressive. The herd follows your movement with the kind of attentive interest that indicates they're treating your reconnaissance mission as potentially valuable intelligence gathering, rather than just individual exploration. This attention creates its own pressure. Suddenly, your route-finding efforts are being evaluated by several hundred animals, whose safety might depend on the accuracy of your assessment. The alternative crossing point you locate isn't dramatically better than the original option, but it offers slightly more gradual entry into the water and what appears to be a more manageable current pattern. Your test crossing, wading carefully into the water while maintaining escape route awareness, demonstrates that the route is challenging but feasible for animals with adequate size and swimming capability. The decision to commit the entire herd to this alternative route falls to you not through any formal leadership process, but simply because you're the one who's conducted the assessment and everyone else is waiting for someone to make a determination. The weight of this responsibility settles onto your shoulders like a heavy coat. Suddenly, you're not just responsible for your own successful crossing, but for the safety of dozens of calves and older animals who might struggle with conditions that you can handle comfortably. The crossing proceeds without major incident, but the experience teaches you something fundamental about leadership responsibility that no amount of theoretical knowledge could have prepared you for. When others depend on your judgment for their safety, every decision carries weight that extends far beyond your personal welfare. The casual confidence that serves you well in individual challenges becomes something more complex when applied to group situations where your miscalculations could harm animals who trusted your assessment. This pattern repeats throughout the following months, as you find yourself increasingly called upon to make decisions for the group during various challenges. Storm shelter selection becomes your responsibility when bad weather approaches, and the herd looks to your experience with local terrain features. Route planning during migrations increasingly reflects your input, as other animals recognize your competence in navigation and obstacle assessment. The loneliness of leadership becomes apparent during these high-stakes decision-making moments. While others can afford to relax and trust in group wisdom, you must maintain constant alertness to potential threats and opportunities that might affect group safety. During rest periods when other animals can fully disconnect from vigilance responsibilities, you find yourself automatically scanning the environment for changes that might require leadership response. Younger bison begin looking to you for behavioral cues during uncertain situations, treating your reactions as indicators of appropriate response levels to potential threats. When you remain calm during encounters with predators or human activity, they interpret this as evidence that alarm isn't warranted. When you display increased alertness, they immediately elevate their own attention levels to match your apparent assessment of threat significance. This responsibility for setting the emotional tone of group responses proves more challenging than making tactical decisions about routes or shelter locations. Your internal stress levels must be carefully managed to avoid communicating anxiety that might create unnecessary panic, while simultaneously maintaining the genuine alertness required for effective threat detection. It's emotional labor that operates constantly in the background of all your other activities. The most demanding leadership challenges arise during crisis situations when rapid decision-making is required and the consequences of error are immediate and potentially severe. A sudden predator encounter requires instant assessment of threat levels, escape route options, and defensive strategies that might protect the most vulnerable herd members. These decisions must be made with incomplete information under time pressure that precludes careful analysis. But there are also moments when leadership provides deep satisfaction that compensates for its stresses and responsibilities. Successfully guiding the herd through challenging terrain or dangerous weather conditions creates a sense of purpose and accomplishment that purely individual achievements can't match. Watching younger animals develop confidence and competence under your guidance provides the kind of fulfillment that comes from contributing to something larger than your own survival and comfort. The recognition of your leadership capability by other adults in the herd represents a form of validation that confirms your transformation from follower to guide. When experienced cows defer to your judgment about route selection or threat assessment, you understand that your competence has been evaluated and found adequate for genuine responsibility rather than just nominal authority. The drought arrives like a slow-motion apocalypse, so gradual in its development that you don't recognize the crisis until grass has transformed from a reliable food source into a theoretical concept that exists mainly in increasingly desperate memories of better times. What begins as an unusually dry spring evolves into a summer where rain becomes as mythical as unicorns and significantly less useful for survival purposes. The initial stages feel manageable. Slightly drier conditions that require minor adjustments to grazing patterns and water source selection. The grass becomes a bit more brown than usual, a bit less dense in the prime growing areas, but still abundant enough that food security doesn't feel threatened. You adjust your territorial boundaries to include areas with better water access, but this seems like prudent resource management rather than crisis response. But as weeks pass without meaningful precipitation, the landscape begins its transformation into something that resembles a badly maintained golf course designed by someone who actively hates grass. The brown spreads like a slow infection across the prairie, turning green areas into memories, and memories into desperate fantasies about climates where vegetation grows reliably. Grass doesn't just become scarce, it becomes a philosophical question. What exactly constitutes grass when the material you're examining has the nutritional value of cardboard and the palatability of sawdust? The few remaining green patches become contested territory, requiring careful negotiation among herd members, who are all reassessing their standards about acceptable food quality and optimal foraging strategies. Water sources that have been reliable for generations begin failing with the casual cruelty of natural systems that don't consider individual convenience when making operational adjustments. Streams that flowed year-round become seasonal. Seasonal streams become geological features that suggest water might have existed here at some point in the distant past. Even the major rivers drop to levels that make crossing easier, but drinking more complicated. Your role as an experienced adult becomes crucial, as younger animals look to your environmental knowledge for guidance about where food and water might still be available. The mental map you've developed over years of territorial exploration suddenly becomes survival-critical information that could determine whether the herd finds adequate resources or continues searching until energy reserves become dangerously depleted. Leading the herd to water sources your experience taught you to remember requires accessing geographical knowledge that you accumulated almost unconsciously during years of routine travel. Remote springs that you noticed but never needed, backup water sources that seemed unimportant during times of abundance, alternative creek beds that might retain moisture longer than the obvious water supplies everyone knows about. These expeditions to marginal water sources become exercises in risk management that require balancing the energy expenditure of extended travel against the probability of finding adequate water at destinations that might have failed, like all the more accessible alternatives. Leading several hundred animals on potentially fruitless searches for water that might not exist represents the kind of leadership challenge that can rapidly transition from difficult but manageable to catastrophic miscalculation. The successful location of a functioning spring 20 miles from the herd's normal range provides the kind of relief that temporarily makes you believe in divine intervention, or at least in the possibility that careful observation and systematic searching can overcome seemingly impossible resource limitations. But the spring's capacity is limited, requiring rotation systems that allow different groups of animals to access water without depleting the source or creating competition that might escalate into actual conflicts. The psychological stress of drought leadership proves as demanding as the physical challenges of extended foraging and water location. Every decision about where to search for resources carries weight that extends beyond your personal welfare to the survival of animals who are depending on your environmental knowledge and leadership capability. The constant pressure of responsibility for group survival creates a level of background stress that affects sleep quality, digestive efficiency, and general mental health, in ways that become apparent only after the crisis has passed. But the drought also brings unexpected challenges that have nothing to do with traditional resource scarcity. Human presence increases dramatically as the changing environmental conditions apparently trigger their own resource management responses that involve unprecedented levels of activity in areas that were previously subject to minimal artificial interference. Fences begin appearing like geometric tumors on the landscape, cutting across traditional migration routes with the geometric precision of entities that have no understanding of how large mammals actually move through natural terrain. These barriers aren't just obstacles, they're fundamental violations of spatial logic that require complete reconceptualization of route planning and territorial management strategies. The fences represent a kind of environmental change that's qualitatively different from natural challenges like drought or severe weather. Natural obstacles can be overcome through traditional bison problem-solving approaches. Alternative routes, patience, superior physical capability, and environmental knowledge. Artificial barriers require entirely new forms of strategic thinking that your evolutionary programming didn't anticipate, and your experiential learning hasn't prepared you to handle. Navigating around fence systems requires developing three-dimensional spatial reasoning about two-dimensional barriers that extend across landscapes in patterns that seem designed by entities with completely different movement requirements than large grazing mammals. Finding gaps, gates, or crossing points becomes a specialized skill that requires systematic exploration and careful mapping of artificial boundary systems that change unpredictably as human activity continues modifying the environment. The combination of drought, stress, and increased human interference creates a perfect storm of environmental challenges that test every aspect of your leadership capability and adaptive intelligence. Successfully guiding the herd through this period requires integrating traditional survival skills with novel problem-solving approaches that address entirely new categories of obstacles. The eventual return of adequate rainfall provides relief that's tempered by the understanding that environmental conditions can change in ways that make traditional survival strategies inadequate. The landscape that emerges from the drought includes permanent alterations, fence lines, road systems, and other human modifications that will require ongoing adaptation rather than simple recovery to previous conditions. At 8 years old, you have achieved the bison equivalent of elder statesmanship, which in practical terms makes you basically Gandalf with hooves and a significantly more impressive beard. Your transformation from ambitious young bull to seasoned veteran has occurred so gradually that you barely noticed it happening, like watching your own hair grow or developing a taste for increasingly obscure varieties of grass. The change becomes most apparent in how younger bulls approach you, or more accurately, how they approach the general vicinity where you happen to be conducting your daily business. Where once you had to actively defend your position through displays of strength and territorial posturing, now your mere presence serves as its own deterrent to casual challenges. Younger animals assess your bulk, your confidence, and your track record of successful confrontations, then make the practical decision that testing your capabilities probably isn't worth the potential consequences. This shift from active dominance to passive authority represents one of the more satisfying developments of middle age. The exhausting performance of constantly proving your worth has been replaced by the comfortable assumption that your worth is already established and generally acknowledged. Younger bulls don't challenge you less because you've become weak or inattentive, but because you've become so obviously competent that challenging you would represent poor risk assessment on their part. Your daily routine has evolved into something approaching perfection through years of careful optimization and incremental improvement. Every aspect of your schedule reflects accumulated wisdom about resource management, energy conservation, and strategic positioning that younger animals couldn't possibly match despite their superior physical capabilities. Your preferred grazing spots aren't necessarily the ones with the greenest grass or the most abundant food sources, but the ones that provide optimal combinations of nutrition, safety, and convenience. You know which areas produce the best grass at different times of year, which locations offer superior sightlines for predator detection, and which spots provide adequate shelter during various weather conditions. This knowledge allows you to maximize nutritional intake while minimizing energy expenditure and risk exposure. Your migration routes reflect similar optimization, following paths that you've refined over years of seasonal travel to minimize unnecessary elevation changes, avoid known obstacle areas, and take advantage of reliable water sources and rest stops. Where younger animals approach migration as a series of improvised solutions to immediate problems, you navigate according to carefully developed strategic plans that account for seasonal variations, weather patterns, and resource availability. Even your wallowing holes represent the culmination of years of research into optimal mud consistency, drainage characteristics, and insect control properties. The casual observer might assume that rolling in mud is a simple pleasure that requires no particular expertise, but experienced bison understand that wallowing is a sophisticated grooming and health management practice that benefits significantly from technical knowledge and quality location selection. Teaching younger generations happens primarily through demonstration rather than active instruction, mostly because bison society doesn't really have formal educational institutions, and individual tutoring would require more patience than you're typically willing to invest in animals who probably won't listen anyway. Instead, you serve as a living example of competent adult behavior that observant younger animals can study and emulate if they possess adequate intelligence and motivation. Your teaching methodology focuses heavily on showing them which grass to avoid, which represents perhaps the most practical survival knowledge you can transmit. Younger animals, driven by enthusiasm and inexperience, often attempt to eat vegetation that looks appealing, but provides poor nutrition or causes digestive problems. Your casual rejection of these food sources, combined with your obvious preference for alternatives that they might have overlooked, provides valuable guidance about resource selection that could save them considerable discomfort and wasted energy. The authority you've developed operates through subtle influence rather than dramatic leadership displays. When you choose to graze in particular areas, other animals interpret this as evidence that these locations offer superior resources or safety characteristics. When you select specific rest spots or shelter areas, others assume your choice reflects superior environmental knowledge that they should respect and potentially emulate. This influence extends to threat assessment and response strategies. Your reactions to potential dangers serve as calibration signals for less experienced animals who haven't yet developed reliable instincts about distinguishing genuine threats from false alarms. When you remain calm during encounters with predators or unusual environmental conditions, others interpret this as evidence that elevated concern isn't warranted. When you display increased alertness, they immediately adjust their own attention levels to match your apparent assessment of the situation. The comfort of operating from established authority rather than contested dominance provides psychological benefits that extend beyond simple stress reduction. You no longer need to constantly monitor potential challenges to your position or prepare for confrontations that might require physical defense of your status. This mental energy can be redirected toward more productive activities like environmental observation, resource optimization, and strategic planning for seasonal challenges. Your reputation for competence and reliability creates a kind of social gravity that draws other animals into your sphere of influence without requiring active recruitment efforts on your part. Younger bulls seek opportunities to graze near you, not because they're consciously seeking mentorship, but because proximity to obviously successful animals provides both learning opportunities and social status benefits that improve their own prospects for advancement. The landscape of your maturity bears increasingly little resemblance to the one where you spent your youth, transformed by human activity that continues expanding, like a slow-motion invasion conducted by creatures who apparently believe straight lines represent significant improvements over the curved and meandering patterns that natural systems spent millions of years developing. Fences multiply across the prairie with the persistence of geometric weeds, creating artificial boundaries that slice through traditional grazing areas and migration routes with the surgical precision of entities that have no understanding of how large mammals actually move through space. What were once continuous territories become fragmented parcels, separated by barriers that serve mysterious human purposes, while creating substantial obstacles for animals whose survival strategies depend on unrestricted movement across large areas. Roads appear with similar frequency and even less consideration for existing wildlife movement patterns, creating permanent scars across the landscape that channel human transportation needs through areas that were previously available for grazing, resting, and general large mammal life activities. These roads bring with them a constant stream of mechanical creatures that move at speeds and noise levels that seem designed to communicate hostility toward anything that might consider occupying the same space. Your traditional territorial boundaries, carefully established over years of strategic positioning and successful defense, undergo forced revision as human modifications eliminate access to areas that were previously integral parts of your resource management system. Grazing areas that provided crucial seasonal nutrition become inaccessible behind fence lines. Water sources that served as anchor points for territorial planning disappear behind private property boundaries marked with signs that presumably explain restrictions in languages that bison education systems never covered. The adaptation process requires the herd to function like a massive ship changing course, slowly, deliberately, and with considerable momentum that makes rapid adjustments impossible, even when circumstances suggest that immediate course corrections might be advisable. Collective decision-making among several hundred animals naturally tends toward conservative choices that minimize risk, rather than innovative solutions that might optimize outcomes, but could also result in catastrophic miscalculations. Finding ways around human obstacles requires integrating traditional environmental navigation skills with entirely new forms of spatial reasoning about artificial barriers and modified landscapes. Gates become crucial geographical features that must be located, tested for accessibility, and incorporated into route planning systems that previously only needed to account for natural obstacles like rivers, canyons, and elevation changes. The strange comfort of routine in an increasingly strange world provides psychological stability that becomes more valuable as environmental predictability decreases. Your established patterns of daily activity serve as anchors of familiarity in a landscape that's undergoing constant modification by external forces beyond your control or understanding. The reliability of your own behavioral routines becomes increasingly important as external reliability diminishes. Seasonal migrations now require advanced scouting to identify route modifications that might be necessary due to new fence installations, road construction, or other human activity that has altered accessibility of traditional travel corridors. What were once reliable pathways between seasonal grazing areas now require contingency planning and alternative route development that adds complexity and energy expenditure to movements that were previously routine and predictable. Water source management becomes increasingly challenging as human development affects both the availability and accessibility of natural water supplies. Springs that flowed reliably for generations may be diverted for human use, or rendered inaccessible by property boundaries that treat water access as a privilege rather than a basic survival requirement for native wildlife populations. The psychological adjustment to these changes proves as demanding as the practical adaptations required for continued survival. The landscape that formed the backdrop for your entire life experience continues to exist, but overlaid with artificial modifications that require constant mental mapping updates and strategic reassessment of routes, resources, and behavioral patterns that were previously stable and reliable. Yet within this context of accelerating change, the fundamental rhythms of bison existence remain remarkably consistent. Grass still grows according to seasonal patterns that human activity hasn't significantly altered. Weather systems continue following atmospheric dynamics that operate independently of fence lines and road systems. The basic requirements of nutrition, shelter, and reproduction continue demanding the same kinds of strategic thinking and environmental assessment that have sustained bison populations for thousands of years. Your accumulated wisdom about traditional survival strategies proves surprisingly adaptable to modified environmental conditions. The same skills that allowed you to find water during droughts help you locate access points around human barriers. The spatial reasoning that guided you through complex terrain during migrations translates effectively to navigation around artificial obstacles and modified landscapes. The changing world requires vigilance and adaptability, but it doesn't fundamentally alter the core competencies that define successful bison existence. Experience still matters. Environmental knowledge remains valuable. Physical capability continues, providing advantages in challenging situations. The wisdom of age, even in rapidly changing circumstances, still offers significant benefits for survival and resource optimization. The long moments of contemplation while chewing cud represent meditation for the unglamorous, a form of spiritual practice that requires no special training, expensive equipment, or philosophical pretensions beyond the basic commitment to thorough mastication of plant material. There's something profoundly centering about the rhythmic process of re-chewing partially digested grass while watching the landscape perform its daily cycle of light changes and atmospheric adjustments. These contemplative periods occur naturally throughout the day, built into the basic digestive requirements of being a ruminant animal, whose survival depends on extracting maximum nutritional value from vegetation that wasn't particularly nutritious to begin with. The necessity of thorough food processing creates mandatory rest periods that encourage reflection and environmental observation without requiring conscious decisions about meditation, timing, or duration. During these quiet interludes, your mind naturally drifts toward broader patterns and longer perspectives that daily survival activities don't usually allow time to consider. The satisfaction of a life lived according to simple principles emerges clearly during these moments of reduced immediate pressure and expanded temporal perspective. Eat, survive, reproduce, repeat. The fundamental algorithm that has guided your existence reveals itself as both remarkably basic and surprisingly sufficient for creating a meaningful and successful life experience. The elegance of this simple framework becomes more apparent with age and experience. Each principle supports the others in ways that create sustainable patterns of behavior that can be maintained across different seasons, environmental conditions, and life circumstances. Eating well provides the energy necessary for survival activities. Successful survival creates opportunities for reproduction. Successful reproduction contributes to the continuation of genetic and cultural patterns that enable future generations to eat, survive, and reproduce in their turn. Watching young bulls make the same mistakes you made provides a peculiar form of entertainment that combines nostalgia, amusement, and the deep satisfaction of recognizing that certain patterns are both inevitable and exactly as they should be. The awkward dominance displays, the miscalculated territorial challenges, the overconfident approaches to environmental obstacles, all these behaviors that seem so obviously misguided from your current perspective represent necessary stages in the learning process that transforms inexperienced juveniles into competent adults. There's wisdom in recognizing that interference with this natural learning process would be both impractical and counterproductive. Young animals need to make their own mistakes and develop their own solutions to the standard challenges of bison existence. The knowledge that comes from direct experience can't be transmitted through observation or instruction. It must be earned through the sometimes painful process of testing assumptions against reality and adjusting behavior based on dimension outcomes. Your role in this educational process is primarily to serve as an example of what successful navigation of these challenges looks like over the long term. The younger generation can observe your techniques, note your resource selection criteria, and study your responses to various environmental and social situations, but they must develop their own competence through practice and experience rather than through passive knowledge transfer. The circular nature of these patterns, watching new generations repeat familiar behavioral sequences while you occupy the position of experienced observer that previous generations once held, provides a sense of continuity and purpose that transcends individual survival concerns. You're participating in something larger and more enduring than any single animal's lifespan, contributing to the preservation and transmission of knowledge and behaviors that have sustained bison populations across generations of environmental and social challenges. At 10 years old, you have entered that distinguished phase of bison existence where moving at maximum speed has become a theoretical concept rather than a practical option, but somehow this limitation feels more like liberation than loss. Your body has begun the gradual process of prioritizing wisdom over raw physical capability, trading explosive power for the kind of measured competence that comes from having solved most of life's essential problems through experience rather than enthusiasm. The changes creep in with the subtle persistence of seasonal transitions, so gradual that you don't notice them day by day, but undeniable when you compare your current capabilities to memories of your peak performance years. Your acceleration from standstill to full gallop now requires what could diplomatically be called extended preparation time, though what it really requires is acknowledgement that your joints have developed opinions about sudden movement that they're not shy about expressing through various forms of muscular commentary. Your morning routine has evolved to include what younger animals might mistake for procrastination, but what you recognize as strategic energy management. The careful stretching that precedes any significant movement isn't vanity or weakness. It's practical maintenance of a mechanical system that's accumulated considerable wear over a decade of prairie navigation, territorial defense, and general large mammal existence in an environment that's never been particularly gentle with its inhabitants. But the respect you command has, if anything, increased rather than diminished with age. Younger bulls approach your vicinity with the kind of cautious deference normally reserved for natural landmarks or weather phenomena, acknowledging your presence as a fixed feature of the landscape that deserves consideration rather than as a dynamic threat that requires immediate response planning. Your reputation has achieved the kind of institutional weight that transcends current physical capability, operating on accumulated credibility rather than demonstrated force. The shift from active dominance to advisory authority represents one of the more psychologically complex transitions of advanced bison life, where once you settled disputes through direct confrontation and maintained territorial boundaries through visible presence and occasional demonstration of defensive capability, now your influence operates through subtler channels that require different skills and offer different satisfactions. Choosing your battles more carefully has evolved from strategic necessity to genuine preference for conflict avoidance. Not because you've become incapable of handling confrontations, but because you've developed sophisticated enough judgment to distinguish between disputes that actually matter and those that exist, primarily to provide younger animals with opportunities to test their developing capabilities against established authority figures. Most battles, you've discovered, don't actually require fighting if you're willing to invest sufficient attention in early intervention and creative problem solving. Territorial disputes that would have automatically escalated to physical confrontation during your prime years can often be resolved through strategic positioning, meaningful stares, and the kind of patient negotiation that's only possible when both parties understand that you're operating from a position of proven competence rather than desperate insecurity. The battles you do choose to engage represent carefully calculated investments of your remaining physical resources in conflicts that offer genuine strategic value rather than simple ego satisfaction. A younger bull testing your access to prime water sources during drought conditions warrants serious response because water access directly affects survival prospects. A juvenile animal making exploratory challenges to your sleeping area preferences doesn't merit the energy expenditure required for dramatic dominance displays when simple relocation provides adequate problem resolution. This discriminating approach to conflict management has created space in your daily routine for activities that provide more lasting satisfaction than territorial defense and social positioning. The finer points of grass selection, which you once approached with the functional efficiency of someone focused on basic caloric requirements, have evolved into something approaching an art form that offers intellectual engagement and aesthetic appreciation beyond simple nutritional optimization. Your palate has developed the kind of sophisticated discrimination that allows you to detect subtle variations in grass quality that younger animals can't perceive and wouldn't appreciate if they could. The difference between grass grown in slightly different soil conditions, the impact of recent rainfall patterns on flavor development, the seasonal timing variations that affect nutritional content and digestibility. These distinctions provide ongoing intellectual challenges that remain engaging even after you've mastered the basic survival requirements. They not support. The younger generation has naturally assumed responsibility for the more dramatic aspects of herd management and territorial defense, allowing you to focus on specialized knowledge application and advisory functions that better suit your current capabilities and accumulated expertise. When conflicts arise that require physical intervention, you can observe and provide strategic consultation while allowing animals with superior speed and stamina to handle the actual confrontation requirements. This division of labor benefits everyone involved. Younger bulls gain valuable experience in leadership responsibilities and conflict resolution while receiving guidance from your superior strategic knowledge and pattern recognition capabilities. You maintain influence and relevance while conserving energy for activities that provide genuine personal satisfaction and contribute meaningfully to group welfare, without requiring physical capabilities you no longer possess at peak levels. Finding dignity in being the wise elder rather than the dominant force requires a fundamental reorientation of identity and self-worth that proves surprisingly rewarding once the initial adjustment period concludes. The constant pressure to demonstrate physical superiority and defend territorial claims has been replaced by the more sustainable satisfaction of being recognized for judgment, experience, and accumulated wisdom that younger animals actively seek rather than challenge. Your daily observations have developed the kind of depth and nuance that comes from having witnessed multiple cycles of seasonal change, environmental challenge, and social dynamics. You can predict weather patterns days in advance based on subtle atmospheric cues that less experienced animals don't recognize. You can assess the quality of grazing areas through quick visual inspection that accounts for soil conditions, drainage patterns, and seasonal growth characteristics that younger bulls would need extended investigation to evaluate. The respect you receive now feels more substantial and durable than the fear-based deference that characterized responses to your physical dominance during peak years. Animals seek your proximity not because they're avoiding confrontation, but because they recognize the practical benefits of access to your knowledge and the psychological comfort of operating under the guidance of someone who's successfully navigated decades of survival challenges. Your territorial claims have evolved from aggressively defended boundaries to generally acknowledged preferences that others respect without requiring enforcement. The premium grazing areas and water access points that you favor remain available to you not because you're capable of defending them against all challenges, but because the social consensus recognizes your claim priority based on seniority and demonstrated competence in resource management. This shift from enforced to consensual authority represents a kind of social security system that acknowledges the value of accumulated experience while providing practical benefits for animals who've contributed significantly to group survival and knowledge transmission. Younger bulls understand that respecting elder privileges today establishes precedents that will benefit them when they reach similar life stages, creating sustainable intergenerational cooperation that serves everyone's long-term interests. The psychological freedom that comes from no longer needing to constantly prove your worth through competitive display and territorial defense opens space for forms of engagement and satisfaction that were previously crowded out by survival pressures and social positioning requirements. You can observe environmental changes with scientific curiosity rather than immediate threat assessment. You can watch social dynamics unfold with anthropological interest rather than strategic calculation about personal implications. Your sleep has improved dramatically with the reduction of stress related to territorial defense and social competition. The constant low-level vigilance that characterized your prime years, always monitoring for potential challenges, always prepared for confrontation, always calculating strategic advantages and defensive positioning, has been replaced by the kind of deep rest that comes from operating within established and generally respected social arrangements. The mentoring relationships that develop naturally with younger animals provide ongoing purpose and engagement that compensate for the reduced excitement of active dominance and territorial competition. Teaching by example remains your primary educational contribution, but the teaching has become more intentional and sophisticated as you've developed better understanding of which knowledge transfers effectively through observation and which requires more direct demonstration. These relationships operate through mutual benefit rather than hierarchical obligation. Younger animals gain access to knowledge and guidance that improves their survival prospects and social advancement opportunities. You receive the satisfaction of contributing to knowledge preservation and the practical benefits of having allies who respect your experience and are willing to provide assistance when your own capabilities prove insufficient for particular challenges. The Great Migration that begins your 11th year carries with it an undercurrent of finality that you recognize without fully acknowledging. Like background music that sets emotional tone without demanding conscious attention. This might be your last journey along the ancient routes that have structured the rhythm of your existence since childhood, though might is probably too optimistic a word for what your body is quietly communicating about its capacity for future long-distance travel across difficult terrain. The preparation for migration reveals changes in your physical condition that can no longer be dismissed as temporary adjustments or minor age-related modifications. The muscle mass that once powered effortless movement across vast distances has begun its gradual redistribution toward more modest proportions that prioritize efficiency over raw capability. Your joints provide increasingly detailed commentary about weather conditions, elevation changes, and the cumulative impact of decades spent navigating terrain that was never designed with comfort in mind. But there's also a profound satisfaction in approaching this potentially final migration with complete mastery of its requirements and challenges. You know every river crossing, every treacherous slope, every area where predator encounters are more likely, and every location that offers superior rest opportunities or protection from severe weather. This knowledge transforms what might otherwise be an intimidating physical challenge into a final examination in subjects you've been studying for your entire adult life. The herd's preparation follows patterns so familiar they feel like seasonal rituals rather than practical necessities. The gradual increase in restlessness as environmental cues signal the approaching need for movement. The subtle shifts in grazing patterns as animals begin consuming extra calories in preparation for extended travel. The social dynamics that determine travel order and positioning within the group during movement. These patterns have remained essentially unchanged, despite all the environmental modifications and human interference that have complicated other aspects of bison existence. Your position within the migration formation reflects your evolved status within the herd hierarchy. No longer positioned for maximum defensive capability or competitive advantage, you've settled into a location that provides optimal balance between energy conservation and access to group protection. Close enough to the center for security benefits, but not so central that you're constantly surrounded by younger animals whose energy levels and movement patterns don't align well with your more measured pace. The early stages of migration proceed with the hypnotic rhythm that you remember from dozens of previous journeys, but now you experience this rhythm with the heightened awareness that comes from knowing you're participating in something that might not be repeated. Each familiar landmark takes on additional significance as a potential final viewing. Each river crossing becomes not just a navigational challenge, but a farewell ceremony for geographical features that have served as anchor points in your mental map of the world. The comfortable predictability of well-worn paths provides psychological comfort that becomes increasingly valuable as other aspects of existence become less reliable due to age-related changes and environmental modifications. The routes that the herd follows represent accumulated wisdom about optimal travel between seasonal grazing areas, tested and refined across generations of migration experience. Following these established pathways feels like participating in a conversation with ancestors who face similar challenges and developed solutions that continue proving effective decades later. Your familiarity with migration routine allows you to anticipate challenges and opportunities before they become obvious to less experienced travelers. You know which creek crossings will be difficult based on seasonal rainfall patterns. You can predict which rest areas will provide adequate shelter based on prevailing wind directions and topographical features. This knowledge enables you to prepare mentally and physically for demanding sections while taking full advantage of opportunities for recovery and resource optimization. The gradual realization that you're setting the pace for your section of the herd rather than struggling to keep up with the general movement provides an unexpected boost to your confidence and sense of purpose. Your measured progress has become the standard that others match rather than a limitation that slows group advancement. The strategic value of your experience in route planning and obstacle navigation outweighs any disadvantages created by reduced physical capability. Water sources along the migration route trigger memories that span your entire adult life. Successful crossings during high water years, difficult passages during droughts, encounters with predators and other wildlife at locations that serve as natural gathering points for multiple species. These geographical features have served as landmarks not just for navigation but for personal development, marking transitions between different life phases and measuring progress in capabilities and understanding. The familiar grazing grounds that serve as waypoints and destinations during migration reveal seasonal changes that you can interpret with the expertise of someone who's observed these locations across multiple decades. Environmental variation, the grass quality, water availability, and shelter characteristics that define each area's value as a migration destination reflect complex interactions between weather patterns, soil conditions, and ecosystem dynamics that you understand through accumulated observation rather than theoretical knowledge. Passing leadership to the next generation happens gradually and naturally, without formal ceremonies or dramatic announcements, because Bison society doesn't recognize retirement parties or official leadership transfer protocols. Instead, the transition occurs through the quiet accumulation of moments when younger animals make decisions that you would previously have made, handle challenges that you would previously have managed, and assume responsibilities that you're increasingly willing to delegate to capable successors. The process feels less like abdication of authority and more like the natural evolution of a mentoring relationship toward greater independence for the students. Younger bulls, who have benefited from observing your decision-making processes and problem-solving approaches, gradually develop confidence in their own judgment and capability. Your role shifts from primary decision-maker to advisor and consultant, providing guidance when requested but allowing others to take responsibility for implementation and outcomes. Stepping back from leadership offers a quiet relief. No longer burdened by constant vigilance or tactical urgency, you now engage as an advisor, contributing wisdom shaped by decades of survival. Observation replaces reaction, experience becomes your offering, and in this new role, a surprising peace emerges. Your knowledge of seasons, predators, droughts, and migrations grows more valuable to younger leaders who, while more physically capable, lack your depth of pattern recognition. The partnership of their energy and your wisdom yields stronger outcomes than either generation could achieve alone. There's deep satisfaction in knowing you've lived the full bison life, surviving blizzards and predators, navigating territory and drought, maintaining status, and reproducing successfully. More than that, you've found meaning beyond survival through resource strategies, social bonds, and leadership that benefited the herd. This clarity, living by natural rhythms rather than imposed expectations, offers existential peace. You've fulfilled your role, and now you help others fulfill theirs. Spring arrives, coloring the land less brown than winter, offering modest beauty and a profound gift. New calves, 60-pound bundles of confusion and potential stumble into the world, defying physics with every step. Watching them faceplant through their first lessons in standing, grazing, and existing is both hilarious and humbling. Their mistakes mirror your own, long past but vividly recalled. Their mothers, stoic and weary, watch with a mix of pride and concern, knowing instinct and evolution will guide their clumsy offspring through the bewildering first days. The calves' trial and error approach to life, testing every plant, misjudging terrain, misreading social cues, reveals timeless patterns repeating with touching precision. Your calving days feel both distant and near. You remember the vigilance, pride, and sheer exhaustion of parenthood. Now, you observe with seasoned understanding, knowing the cycle continues. Your role has shifted from participant to custodian of wisdom. Your strategies, instincts, and experiences subtly shape the next generation through demonstration, not instruction. The knowledge isn't just functional, it's spiritual. You walk trails carved by ancestors, contribute to patterns older than memory. You've lived your chapter in the bison story with quiet dignity. No heroics, just consistent, competent survival. And that, in a world shaped by unpredictable forces, is profound achievement. The cycle continues, the grass grows, the calves learn, and your legacy endures in the land, in the herd, and in the rhythm of life that moves forward, steady and eternal.